So is there such thing as overtraining, and are you doing it? So does working out daily and vigorously help turn you into a different kind of beast? Or is it actually impeding your performance and your growth, and in fact increasing your risk of death? The term is often thrown around and it's a bit ambiguous, but I want to bring some clarity to it in this video, addressing both the physiological and the psychological consequences of it. Asking, is it truly bad for you? Do genetics play a part? Is there a difference between overdoing in a single session and chronically overtraining? And of course, what to do to avoid it and recover from it if you are experiencing it. These are the questions I'll be exploring in this video. So we train because we want to induce a certain level of stress. We want the body, through the process of hormesis, to develop to the stimulation that we place upon it. That is, we want to strain it and cause an adaptive development, whether it be in cardio or strength or speed. And if we think of exercise as a medicine in the form of a pill, imagine if you could take medicine in a pill. Well, if you could produce such a thing, you'd be filthy rich for all the benefits. But like any medicine, there appears to be with exercise a dose-response relationship, that is hormesis. We perhaps shouldn't fall for this simple, almost childlike notion that more is always better. And like any medicine, when taken to excess, may have negative consequences. And in fact, the response to this drug, the response to this medicine varies tremendously depending on the dose. So what is overtraining? Well, it's quite arbitrary and it's difficult to define because it is quite complex in its very nature. But what we do have are certain clues about its consequence, and therefore it might best be described as a syndrome. That is a maladaptation to excessive exercise without adequate rest that lead to multiple system dysfunction within the body, including immunological, neurological, and to your endocrine systems, associated also with mood changes. Essentially, it is imbalance between the stress of training, also compounded by the stress in life, and then not getting sufficient rest and recovery. So there is no single biometric marker that can be used to define it. But there are certain clues, physiological changes such as a reduction in the maximum heart rate, but it is all characterized by generally poor performance, an inability to grow and develop, mood changes, disruption to sleep, and exposure to injury and illness. So it's commonly seen in endurance athletes, your swimmers, cyclists, ultramarathon runners, and how prevalent it is difficult to say, but a study did show that in collegiate endurance athletes it was around 10%. Now this is not to be confused with overreaching, which is essentially what athletes are aiming for, which is to push their physiological limits beyond what was done previously and create a level of stress that does require recovery. So there will be a period where there is a diminished capacity for performance afterwards. This may be only though days and weeks, compared to overtraining where the recovery period can be weeks to months. So let's break this down. Let's first look at the immune system. So it's not a controversial thing to say that regular exercise supports the immune system and immune health. Data supports a clear inverse relationship between exercise and illness risk. And if we look at this graph taken from a study looking at overtraining and the immune system, which specifically looked at contracting the common colds, we can observe that susceptibility to disease decreases as one graduates from a sedentary to moderate exercise. But when pushed to an exhaustive state, immune function actually declines. And unsurprisingly, when that happens, susceptibility to illness increases to a point even beyond that experienced by someone who's completely sedentary. Consider that prolonged bouts of strenuous exercise might have this effect of at least temporarily diminishing some of the immune components, making you more susceptible to disease. Inhibiting neutrophils, lymphocyte proliferation, monocyte antigen presentation, all these important components and parts of the immune system that are crucial in defending off foreign pathogens. And this usually lasts between about 3 and 24 hours after a vigorous bout of exercise. And this is most pronounced when you're doing exercise that is 55 to 75% of your VO2 max, and you're doing it for an hour and a half or longer and without nutrition. When those three things happen, that is when you get, it appears, the most immune dysfunction. As a very temporary thing, it's not an issue. However, when you compound that and you think that someone might be engaging in this activity 7 times a week, then it potentially could lead to increased risk of illness. It appears there's about a 100 to 500% increased risk in the chance of picking up an infection post a ultra endurance running event, although some studies have failed to show this. If you're enjoying this video or finding it even slightly interesting, then I would love to have you along for the journey. Please do subscribe, hit the ring ding ding bell, and it'll be the easiest thing you do today, but it might just benefit you for years to come. There was a study, not the nicest study, but one that used rats and studied the effects of different endurance training on components of their immune system. And they took these rats and grouped them into sedentary, moderate exercise, overtrained, and overtrained with recovery. And what essentially they had them do was they placed them on a treadmill, placed a shock grid at the back of the treadmill that would administer a small shock should they not be able to keep pace. And they put them on completely different training regimes, both in the speed at which they ran on the treadmill, for how long, and for how many times a week, and for how many weeks. And what they showed was very interesting, was that in the overtrained group, the one that were working at maximum intensity every day essentially for many weeks, showed there was a huge increase and lasting increase up to 2 weeks after recovery of certain immune factors, specifically tumor necrosis factor and interleukin 6. Interleukin 6, a very, very crucial component of the immune system. Interleukin 6, or IL-6, is produced in skeletal muscle in response to heavy exercise. And it has many, many different roles in the body. And larger amounts of this cytokine are produced in exercise than any other. And it has huge, widespread effects. It's thought in short term, it does actually help defend against inflammation and infection, which seems like a positive. It also helps mobilize fat tissues through lipolysis, and also helps encourage the liver to produce glucose. However, what we also know about interleukin is that it causes fatigue, can cause fevers, and actually helps encourage and increase osteoclast activity, which are the cells that break down bones, leading to osteoporosis. Temporary rise in interleukin 6, this is perhaps inconsequential, but as I said, there seems to be a significantly lasting effect with more vigorous exercise and when done over time, leading to a much more sustained level. So if your body is constantly producing interleukin 6 at high levels, then perhaps you run the risk of some of these pro-inflammatory consequences. But in truth, there are probably several different mechanisms by which exercise, when done vigorously, can impede the immune system in some way. You've got an increased production of reactive oxygen species, these free radicals which are inflammatory, which do have certain benefits as well, but overall are inflammatory. You've probably got a greater exposure to airborne pathogens. Although you are increasing the ventilation in the lungs, you are still exposing yourself to more pathogens. You're increasing gut permeability, which again increases your exposure to pathogens, especially when training in heat. And of course, certain exercises when done in excess and in a stressful environment can increase your level of stress hormones, which has the overall effect, especially over time, of dampening your immune system. So it's likely that this increased infection risk is multifactorial, and it's difficult to sometimes tease out exactly certain components of what is causing what. But overall, it does appear to be a negative consequence on the immune system when exercise is done to a point of exhaustion and done every day without sufficient recovery. So next, let's talk about hormones, the endocrine system. Now, I should say that there are a large number of inconsistencies in the literature regarding the hormones and the effects of it. Again, difficult to tease out what is simply an adaptive response and what is dysfunction, what might be temporary, what is longer lasting. But I will highlight some potential key findings. In one study, they took a group of endurance athletes, in this case they were cyclists and runners, and they were monitored before, during and after an intense 8 to 10 week training program that massively increased their volume compared to their usual regimen. The idea to put them through increased stress, people who are already adapted and trained. What they found was that overtrained athletes had a massive reduction in testosterone, an increase in prolactin, and an increase in cortisol, the stress hormone. And this was echoed in another study that aimed to substantiate this hypothesis that vigorous exercise might disrupt the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, this complex sequence and communication between different endocrine glands that produce various different hormones. And again, very difficult thing to assess. And the results indicated that again there was a huge decrease in testosterone and at the same time a huge increase in cortisol, and even in fact suggested there was a decrease in sperm concentration up to 74 days later. So testosterone actually shows a two-phase behavior. After short duration, it increases in relation to intensity, volume, and muscle mass. However, after extended periods, 3 hours or longer, it decreases. And if you imagine again the compounded effects of doing this every single day, this might lead to a more sustained lower level of testosterone. But this ratio between testosterone and cortisol is often used as an indicator as to whether someone is in an anabolic, that is a growth, or catabolic state. And so what these study participants show was this hugely decreased ratio, which might indicate this massive impedance in being able to effectively recover and grow following the exercise. They are going to struggle to be in an anabolic state. But to what extent this decreased testosterone equates to energy and fertility and virility is difficult to say. I think if you're aiming for hypertrophy, that is the growth of muscles, and effective recovery following intense exercise, then it demonstrates a likelihood that you will need to rest properly in order that you can effectively recover. and to that point perhaps not exercising for egregiously long periods of time too often, because you run the risk of a more sustained low level of testosterone. So next is DNA damage. Studies have shown that ultramarathon runners demonstrate DNA damage in up to 10% of their cells during and up to 2 weeks after an event. In a study where participants were placed on a treadmill to exhaustion, understandably there's a huge spike in free radicals in their blood. Now, free radicals are these byproducts of oxygen metabolism that are thought to be damaging and inflammatory. But like anything, it's in moderation. So it's actually thought in lower concentrations to be a really important signaling molecule, that it helps the heart beat more forcefully and therefore increasing your cardiac output and therefore performance. But like anything, it appears that in excess it may lead to damaging the cells. And in these participants, they found again there was damage within the DNA when placed to exhaustion. Now interestingly, when these participants were placed on a treadmill but given watercress beforehand, they failed to observe this same increase in free radicals. And in fact, when these participants ate a daily serving for 2 months, no matter how much they punished them on the treadmill, they could not detect any DNA damage. So like I said, everything in moderation. It seems that small doses, important signaling molecule, but perhaps chronic overexposure might lead to more inflammation and excessive DNA damage. So vascular health, your cardiovascular system. Again, always associated with exercise being of benefit to the cardiovascular system. People who exercise more generally, lower risk of heart attack, stroke, arrhythmias, you name it. And once again, it may be that more is not always better. In a prospective study in the UK, they looked at 1.1 million different women over the course of 9 years, surveying them and their exercise frequency and type and measuring cardiovascular risk and outcomes. So unsurprisingly, what you see is a huge decrease in the risk of coronary artery disease, cerebrovascular disease, i.e. strokes, and also venous thromboembolism, like clots on the lungs, like PE. And this was true when going from a sedentary to moderate exercise. That was classified as sort of between 3, 4, 5 times a week, and this could range in intensity. But again, this benefit was actually lost if that exercise was daily. And you can see here from the graphs that there's actually an increase in risk when progressing to daily exercise. And this was true whether it was strenuous or not. But without that rest period, it was associated with increased risk of all these things. And this was true when they looked at athletes. There was a study that observed 35-year-old competitive athletes. And so these are people with considerable years of endurance sport exposure. And again, routine to low, moderate intensity physical exercise was associated with a lower cardiovascular risk. But once again, the dose-response relationship between exercise and cardiovascular risk remains incompletely misunderstood, and there's mounting evidence to show, like in this study, that in fact those who are exercising most vigorously were an enhanced risk of AF, atrial fibrillation, which is the most common arrhythmia of the heart. And many people have it without even realizing, but it is associated with an increased risk of mortality. And it may be that simply just constant stress and constant higher blood pressure as well, which was identified as a risk factor, was a cause of this. And it may be that those engaging in this high level of exercise are surprisingly susceptible to certain cardiovascular risks. And it showed the cumulative effect of exposure to endurance exercise and the risk of developing an arrhythmia. Again, this might be just simply because of the inflammatory state that one is putting themselves through too regularly and without that effective recovery. Constantly having stress hormones, inflammatory cytokines and proteins in the blood, high levels of lactate, and without necessarily being battled and balanced with the recovery and nutrition, then you run the risk of doing longer lasting damage. So although there is a huge amount to be learned about overtraining syndrome, there does appear to be some negative consequences that we can pick out that overall just paint a picture of when we are pushing a little bit too hard and we're no longer getting the quality return on our investment. And I think that is sometimes when you need to know when to pump the brakes, because ultimately it's not going to allow us to achieve what we want. And so what are the telltale signs? Well, often it's just simply because you hit a plateau. You're no longer able to take things to the next level. You're no longer beating your PBs. You're no longer putting up more weight in the gym. You're not running longer or faster. And generally it might also be combined with low mood, fatigue, poor motivation, disrupted sleep, mood swings. All these different things that might come together to surmount a cocktail, just showing that your body and your mind are perhaps rejecting the paces that you're putting it through. It's probably screaming out for you to say, let's just have a rest day. And it may be useful just to consider the type of exercise you're doing, because if you're someone, let's say an endurance runner, it may even just be sensible, if you're unwilling to truly pump the brakes, but just to think about rotating your exercise. If you want to commit to a 7-day routine, think about maybe engaging in something that's less weight bearing if you're a runner, therefore giving your joints a rest as well, something that's less inflammatory like swimming. Or if you're wanting to still do something healthy and perhaps even something challenging, you could do something like a cold plunge, do some mobility work, yoga, go into a sauna. There are lots of other different physical things that you can do that could be considered more restful, that could be considered more regenerative, and are not going to put the same strains. And in this way, you're rotating the stress that you're putting on the body. The other thing is to appreciate that we are starting at different points. Mo Farah did not start off running 140-mile weeks, but now he bashes them out. So you need to think about where you are in your training regime and think about how to graduate it safely and effectively. And this is what we call our training age. And as well as factoring in days off, you might want to do what a lot of pro athletes do, which is called periodizing, which is every 6 to 8 weeks actually having a slightly longer period of recovery. Even, a week or 2 weeks off where you're focusing primarily and strongly on nutrition and sleep. And you'll often find that when you come back after that period, you feel so much better, so much stronger. And even though you've had a week or two without exercising, you're able to perform better. And this was certainly the theory of Mike Mentzer, the bodybuilder, who had a completely different dynamic approach to bodybuilding, in which he thought the main focus should be on rest and recovery, intense exercise, but with lots of recovery. Again, multiple ways to skin a cat, but if you're trying to avoid injury, you're trying to avoid some of the fatigue issues associated with it, if you think you are particularly susceptible, then think a lot about your rest. Think of it as part of your exercise regime, because it is very often the thing everyone neglects. They constantly focus on how far they have to run, their pace, how much they need to lift, how often they need to do it. The next thing often becomes nutrition, okay, how they support them, but they very rarely think about how many hours sleep am I getting, how effective is that sleep, what am I doing to rest, and what am I doing to encourage recovery of the muscles and our body systems. So I fully respect there's, the militant attitude of every day, no days off. That's great. People like David Goggins, I think it's fantastic, but I think a lot of that behavior comes down to, as he would probably say, developing that tungsten fortitude. It's more there for the mental battle, which I think is great. And I think sticking to a routine is fantastic. And as I said, if you want to be doing those 7-day weeks, you might just want to circulate the exercise. Do something else. So you're still sticking to a routine. You still feel like you've accomplished something, and it could even be something challenging. But if you are risking mental fatigue as well, if you're not David Goggins, then you need to think about maybe something else. In the sessions that you are working, don't forget to work hard. And that's what we shouldn't forget. We do the rest so that we can work hard and overreach in those training sessions. Because if you're training every single day, but you're only really putting 60% because your body can't do it, then you're not getting the adaptive quality that you should do. And I think that has to be the focus, is improvement, is trying to better yourself. So regarding nutrition and sleep, these are two massive topics on themselves that we could talk about. But all I would say is regarding the calories, there are some interesting studies, but just take into account your basic metabolic rate, take into account how much you're expending on the exercise, and then also any other needs if you are repairing from an injury, but also if you are aiming for a state of hypertrophy, an anabolic state, you're trying to grow, put on mass, then you need to account for that as well. An interesting study that looked at Jamaican sprinters showed them over a season of training and assessed which ones were adapting well to the training program and which ones were not, which ones were maladapting. And they were able to pick out a few key things from this. And it seemed to be that those who were adapting better had a higher caloric intake, they focused more on nutrition, and they also had a higher carbohydrate intake. They made up a greater percentage of their intake. Again, I'm not going to get right now into the pros and cons of carbohydrates, but just in this context of performance, it seemed to be beneficial for that quick release energy and improving their performance and their ability to recover, at least, as well. So aiming for that 6 grams per kilogram per day seemed to have redeeming quality in their performance. So in summary, we're trying to find that fine line, aren't we, between really stressing ourselves, pushing our boundaries, and not grinding ourselves into a patty. It's a form of supervised stress, and I think that's the best way to look at it. You are in control of how much stress you put your body through, and so you have to be clever and intuitive about what your body can handle and your mind, and give it the tools it needs to recover. We want to put it through enough stress, but without incurring the risk of injury and illness that ultimately is going to set us back. And if you have to take a day to recalibrate yourself, then so be it, just so you can come back stronger. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.